A couple of winters ago, when I was driving home from church in my little black truck, I slid off the road. It had snowed the night before, and the road was completely snow covered. And this particular morning was a brilliant sunny winter day, and that snow packed road had just turned to ice. And I slid off the road. I wasn't going very fast, so I didn't hurt myself, and I banged up my truck a little bit. I slid into one of those power substations on a corner. And when I gathered my wits and finally opened the door and stepped out into about knee-deep snow, I looked up and I noticed that just not even 20 yards away from me, there was a tow truck already there, and he was helping another disabled vehicle. And so I trudged through the snow and I walked over and I said to the tow truck operator, "Can you pull me out of the snow too?" And he looked over at my truck and he said, "Yep, I can do it. Just let me wrap this up for this customer here." I didn't have to call anybody. I didn't have to wait very long. Rescue was already on the scene for this little accident that I had. As we were in the process of getting my truck out of the ditch, I asked the tow truck driver, "What's your name?" And he looked at me and he said, "Gabriel." And I said, "Of course it is." Here's what I want you to know today. Sometimes rescue is already closer than you even think. And we're going to be in Genesis chapter 8 today that begins with one of the most hopeful sentences in this narrative about Noah and the flood. It begins with, "God remembered Noah." I'm so glad you've joined me today. This is Bible for Newbies. Welcome to Bible for Newbies. I'm Russ Michaels. I'm a pastor, an author, and a worship leader from Bozeman, Montana, and I love the Bible. I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is for you if you're new to reading the Bible, or if you've been reading for a while and you want to go deeper. My goal is to help untangle the confusing stuff so your Bible reading feels rewarding and life-giving, not frustrating or overwhelming. One of Jesus' disciples, Peter, wrote that the scriptures are like light shining in a dark place. I think reading the Bible is like flipping your headlights to high beam when you're driving on a dark country road. Suddenly, things get clearer, you can see the road ahead and avoid the ditches. So come take a ride with me, and let's turn on the light. Okay, before we get to Genesis chapter 8, let me give you a quick recap. In Genesis chapter 6, we saw that corruption had spread through the whole earth. And in Genesis chapter 7, we read about these floodwaters rising and all of creation is collapsing back into chaos. And we see Noah and the ark, his family, all of the animals floating on the surface of the water for months. And now we get to Genesis chapter 8, and all of this chaos and crisis that we read about in chapter 7 kind of smooths out, and the story in essence starts to breathe again. And what we're going to see here is that God makes a way through the judgment of the earth toward renewal. And it's really beautiful. So let's read Genesis chapter 8. And I imagine probably most of you listening are doing other things, so I don't expect you to open up your Bible. But if you've got a Bible, open up to Genesis chapter 8. I'm in the NLT version today. Here we go. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the flood waters began to recede. The underground waters stopped flowing, and the torrential rains from the sky were stopped. So the flood waters gradually receded from the earth. After 150 days, exactly 5 months from the time the flood began, the boat came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. 2.5 months later, as the waters continued to go down, other mountain peaks became visible. After another 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the boat and released a raven. The bird flew back and forth until the floodwaters on the earth had dried up. Noah also released a dove to see if the water had receded and to see if it could find dry ground. but the dove could find no place to land because the water still covered the ground. So it returned to the boat, and Noah held out his hand and drew the dove back inside. After waiting another 7 days, Noah released the dove again. This time the dove returned to him in the evening with a fresh olive leaf in its beak. Then Noah knew that the floodwaters were almost gone. He waited another 7 days and then released the dove again. This time it did not come back. Noah was now 601 years old. On the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began. I want to just say that again. 10.5 months after the flood began. The floodwaters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted back the covering of the boat and saw that the surface of the ground was drying. 2 more months went by, and at last the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, "Leave the boat, all of you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Release all the animals, the birds, the livestock, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, so they can be fruitful and multiply throughout the earth." So Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives left the boat, and all the large and small animals and the birds came out of the boat, pair by pair. And then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed as burnt offerings the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. And you remember that he had brought extra animals into the boat for sacrifices and for food. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night." And that's how chapter 8 ends. Now, I've been chuckling a little bit as I've been reading these chapters because there's a phrase. This has nothing to do with really the meaning of this section. I just want to mention this today. There's a phrase that I keep stumbling over, probably because I've read these chapters more often in the NIV translation or even King James when I was growing up. But there's this phrase in the NLT, the small animals that scurry along the ground. And every time we come to this description of the animals and what animals were included, in the NLT it says the small animals that scurry along the ground. And this week when I was studying, I had to push into that because I had to find out what was going on, because it's so specific, right? It's oddly specific. So here's what I found. That whole phrase, 8 words in English, is just one Hebrew word. It's the word remes, R-E-M-E-S, remes. And this word, it's a noun. It comes from a Hebrew verb, ramos, which means to creep or crawl or move, scurry, close to the ground. So the noun is actually derived from how these animals, these creatures, move. And so in the Hebrew language, it's talking about all the little crawlers and skitterers and scampers and all the creeping things of the world. Now, in modern scientific classification, we classify animals by biology or DNA. But what's interesting is that in Genesis, animals are classified by where they live and how they move. So in Genesis, we read about swimmers and flyers and walkers and crawlers. So this is language that a real human being would have used many centuries, millennia ago, to describe the world the way they saw it. And so that's what's behind this phrase, the small animals that scurry along the ground, just in case you were wondering. Now, let's talk about what's happening in this chapter. What we just read was that as Noah and his family are floating above the floodwaters, with time, the waters began to recede. And eventually the ark came to rest on a mountain. And so to test to see if the earth was habitable yet, Noah began to release these birds. The first one was a raven. The second one was a dove. And eventually, the dove came back with this olive leaf, and Noah could see that there was dry ground appearing. And so he knew that after this long period of waiting, it was finally time to leave the ark. And then the story ends with sacrifice and worship, and we're going to talk about that when I wrap up this story. And so you probably noticed, if you've been listening along with this series in order, this chapter feels very different than Genesis chapter 7. Chapter 7 was catastrophic and violent, and if you're an empathic person like I am, or you have a vivid imagination, it probably felt a little overwhelming. But this chapter is quiet and kind of patient, a little bit cautious, hopeful for sure. And like I mentioned before, it starts with God remembered Noah. Now, I talked about that phrase in my last episode, and I mentioned that when Genesis says that God remembered Noah, it doesn't mean that God had forgotten about him for a while and suddenly thought, oops, I better check in on Noah. That's not what it means. When the Bible uses this language of remembering, it means that God is bringing to mind his covenant faithfulness. And when he remembered Noah, he's turning to someone with action. He's moving on Noah's behalf. And so Genesis 8 starts with this turning point of God remembering Noah because, I mean, you've heard the story. Noah's been floating in silence for months. As far as we know, there hadn't been any updates. He hadn't seen dry ground in a very long time. The rainbow's going to come later. Noah's just floating and waiting. And I was thinking about it, if I was on a boat floating above the flooded world, I'd be really sad if I didn't have my Sonos stereo system, something to listen to. And so this is what these human beings are going through, just waiting. And a lot of us know what that feels like, don't we? Waiting for healing, or waiting for clarity, waiting for restoration, or waiting for life to feel stable again. And if you're in a waiting period in your life, can I just encourage you today? Don't allow the silence to confuse you. Because the silence is not the same thing as abandonment. This is why I'm making such a big deal about this line that God remembered Noah. Because I can imagine that Noah wondered where God was, if it was really as silent as it seems to be. But God didn't abandon Noah. He was just in a season of waiting until the next part of the rescue would come. Now, the next thing we read was that God sent a wind over the waters. And I loved this part when we were reading it, because if you've been with me since Genesis chapter 1, that language of the wind blowing across the waters should sound a little bit familiar. And there's a lot of hyperlinks from this chapter back to the beginning of Genesis. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, it describes the chaos, tohu wabohu, at the very beginning of Genesis chapter 1. And it talks about the Spirit, or the wind of God, hovering over the waters. And here in chapter 8, it describes these floodwaters, chaos again. And we read about the wind of God blowing. In both chapters, in both instances, the word in the Hebrew is the word ruach. Ruach. And that word can be translated wind, or breath, or spirit. So depending on the context of the chapter that word is used, or the sentence the word is used in, it can mean any of those things. It can mean a wind. It can mean the breath of God. It can mean the Spirit of God. There's a little ambiguity that is really beautiful. And I think what I want you to see right here is that it's the same God in Genesis 8 that is bringing order from the chaos of the waters. And what we saw in Genesis 7, in our last episode, was that creation had collapsed back into the chaos of the water. And now in this chapter, it's like God is starting creation moving forward again. It's not that he's recreating the world, but there is certainly a new beginning. As the waters separated, kind of like Genesis 1, as the dry land appears, again, hyperlinked to Genesis 1, there's birds and animals and human beings stepping into a new beginning. And it's almost like Genesis chapter 1 starts playing again. So here's what I want you to think about with me. The flood story isn't just about God destroying the earth. It's really about recreation. So now let's talk about this waiting period that Noah is in. You probably picked up, because I emphasized it a little bit, that the ark landed on this mountain a long time before Noah and his family exited. They're just hanging out in the ark, waiting. They're waiting even after the mountains appear, after the dry ground appears, even after the dove comes back with that olive leaf. They're still waiting. And Noah is waiting for God's instruction. And again, there's no music to listen to. There's no Instagram to doom scroll. There's no video games to just play and entertain yourself with. I just can't imagine how bored these people must have been, although there were a lot of animals to feed. The chores were probably overwhelming. But here's what I think. I think that after 10 months on that ark, there had to be some kind of serious cabin fever, right? Or we could call it ark fever. The rain had stopped, the mountains were visible, but they were still waiting inside. And if we're going to apply this to our lives, I think sometimes we get frustrated. I can speak for myself. I get frustrated because the storm is over, but we still feel stuck on the boat. And so what we have to kind of cope with is the reality that there's a difference between surviving a storm and then rebuilding after it. And I know that a lot of you listening today can understand this, probably on a deep level. If you've been going through grief or burnout, if you've suffered a divorce or an extended illness, or if you're in recovery, or even think back to the pandemic that we all lived through now 6 years ago. We survived, but you don't quite know how to step back into life again. And I was thinking about this as I was working on this. The pandemic was hard. As a pastor, it was so hard because all of a sudden the government shut us down. We couldn't gather. And listen, church is my life. I love my church family. I love Sundays. I look forward to Sundays. It's not a job for me. Church is my family, getting together and worshiping together and learning together and loving one another. And those weeks in Montana, it was shorter than in a lot of parts of the world. There were weeks where we weren't allowed to gather. And then when the government said it's okay for us to gather, and there were restrictions about how close we could sit and masks and all that stuff, it was a nightmare. But when we finally were given the green light to gather again, there were hundreds of people who didn't want to come back to church. They were afraid. Or they were mad because their friends at church were on the wrong political aisle, and we argued about to mask or not to mask, and which political allegiance do you have. It was so hard. And it felt like that waiting time after the pandemic went forever. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't until about 4, maybe even 5 years after the pandemic struck that church started to feel normal to me again. And whatever waiting thing you're going through, listen, you can know this. Sometimes God rescues us in stages. And that's certainly how it was with the pandemic. And whatever waiting period you're in, I want you to know God has rescue for you. But it might come in stages. There might be kind of rollout. Now, Noah releases these birds. A raven. You probably know ravens, or in our area, we've got crows and magpies and these big birds that feed on dead stuff. The raven went out and it didn't come back because a raven can survive on floating debris and carry on in the water. It was able to survive. It was probably able to find plenty to eat. But the dove, a much more delicate bird, couldn't find any kind of a resting place. So it came back to the ark. At one point, it brings back an olive leaf. Noah knew that there's stuff growing, but eventually the dove didn't come back. And what was Noah doing with these birds, sending the birds out? Well, he was searching for signs of life. Is the earth habitable again? Is rescue here yet? And it's interesting to me that olive leaf became a tiny signal that the world is becoming habitable again. So again, if you're in this waiting season right now, you might be looking for signs of life. What are they? What tests are you sending out? There will come a time when the test reveals that the rescue is complete. Just don't rush it. Wait for God to speak. Wait for God to signal. In Noah's case, God had to open the door. And I know for lots of us, sometimes we have to wait until God sovereignly opens a door for the waiting period to be over. God hasn't forgotten you. He remembers you, just like he remembered Noah. I promise you he does. Now I want to wrap up with this. When Noah finally came out of the ark, the first thing he does is worship. Might have been tempting to start building a shelter or sowing seeds in a field to start a farm or finding a way to make his family comfortable. But the first thing he does is worship. And there's a description here that I'm sure you caught, that you picked up as I was reading, that there was a sacrifice and burning and the aroma that pleased the Lord. I'm not going to go into this a lot. That's probably a topic for another episode. But what I want you to know is this sacrifice is not about trying to appease God's anger. It's not Noah trying to do something that is going to bring God's favor upon him. It's just simply worship. And in a way, the sacrifice is an expression of an acknowledgement that he depends on God and God is his source. He doesn't need to hoard animals for food. He can give something up to the Lord. He's acknowledging his own dependence on God, which I think is beautiful. And when the rescue was complete, Noah's first response was worship. He built an altar and he welcomed God into this new beginning. And I want all of us to remember today, as we think about this story, that even after the chaos or the floodwaters of our life, we still need inner renewal. And the tough reality of this story, and in our next episodes, we're going to go into this. The sad reality of the flood is that it didn't erase the human condition, and really that wasn't what God was trying to do. Because there's some really troubling stuff coming ahead in the story. We're going to get to the end of the next chapter, and you're going to see that Noah had a pretty catastrophic failure. And in a future episode, we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel, another failure on people's parts. And ultimately, what we see here in these beginning chapters of Genesis is again and again, there's this deep need for rescue that eventually is found in Jesus. And that's the good news of all of us that get to live in this day and age. Jesus has been revealed. Jesus came to rescue us from the power of sin. Jesus gives us new life, working on us from the inside out. That's the ultimate rescue. And this story of Noah and the flood just merely looks forward to the rescue that Jesus would someday bring for all human beings, and you and I get to know on a personal level. So let me just ask you a couple of questions for you to reflect on. Does your life feel stormy today? Are you waiting for dry ground? Have you mistaken silence for abandonment? Or maybe are you trying to rush ahead and open the doors before God is leading you or opening the door for you? Can I remind you that the same God who moved over the waters in Genesis chapter 1 still moves through the chaos today? And I think that's probably the biggest thing I want you to carry with you from this chapter, chapter 8. The flood didn't have the final word, although the storm was real and the waiting was real and the silence was real. The rescue was real too. And eventually God opened the door of the ark and the dry ground spread out before them and life began again. And so the season you're in today, if life still feels gray and flooded and uncertain, don't lose your hope in the waiting. God has not abandoned you in the silence. And so if you want to go a little bit deeper today, let me give you a reading invitation. Today I read Psalm 29. It's a short little psalm. It's a great psalm. Just, 8 or 10 verses. And this is the key verse towards the end of the psalm. The Lord rules over the floodwaters. The Lord reigns as king forever. So if you just want a psalm to help you worship or wait or refocus your attention, go to Psalm 29, read it today or in the next couple of days. And you can remember that as the floodwaters are rising, you can know the storm won't last forever. God is a God of rescue and renewal is coming. Your new beginning is coming. And I believe that to be absolutely true. Thanks for joining me today on Bible for Newbies, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for turning on the light with me today here on Bible for Newbies. If something in this episode brought clarity or gave you something new to think about, would you share it with a friend? You never know who else might need that same bit of light. And if you're listening on a platform where you can leave a rating or a comment, that helps more people find the podcast. And I read every comment you leave. So that's it for today. Until next time, keep walking in the light.